Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the Follower Podcast. My name is Matthew Lewis, and I'm your host in this place where we talk about what it means to follow Jesus in the world today. I've been away for a little while. I was doing some work with my recently published book, Human, where I visited some friends in Wales and London and Loughborough and my good friends in Waverley Abbey, and even got to spend some time with friends in Italy doing a week of teaching on the book of Acts in the beautiful space of Trentino, and then my good friends at Renowned Church in Abu Dhabi. So shout out to all of you, all those communities. Wonderful to be with you in those places. But now I'm back in Durban, South Africa, and excited to let you know that we are building up to a brand new Follower Podcast series. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you'll know that last year we did a series in collaboration with 24/7 Prayer South Africa, where we called it the One Heart series, and it was all about reconciliation. And I have spoken to some people who are like, man, why all this talk of reconciliation? And I just want to say, as we'll learn in the coming weeks together, that this is not peripheral to the gospel. This is the heart of what it means to follow Jesus, particularly in the world today. And so to build toward that, some of you know that we hosted the first 24/7 prayer gathering in South Africa earlier this year. We thought we would release the main session talks from the 24/7 gathering. And so starting from today, every day for the next 10 days, we're going to be releasing a podcast a day, giving you the main session talks from that gathering and then building towards the 50 days or 7 weeks of prayer for reconciliation. If you are interested in that series on prayer, I'd really invite you to go to the 24/7 South Africa website and have a look at the One Heart Prayer series, where you can find out all about how to get your community involved, or even just to get involved yourself when we launch on the 9th of June, Pentecost Sunday, and begin to pray for 7 weeks into reconciliation in our nation and the nations of the world. So that's what we're building towards. But in this episode, you're going to hear from Nkosinathi Mbuyazi and Danielle Strickland, who kicked off the 24/7 national gathering in South Africa earlier this year. And I hope that this conversation, these talks, really encourage you as you follow Jesus in the world today. Here we go, friends.
Just wanted to say this, we're a people of joy. Do you agree? You don't sound convinced. So Paul writes so many times, and he says, rejoice in the Lord. And he says, I will say it again, rejoice in the Lord. And then later on he says, it is no issue for me to remind you again of this, rejoice in the Lord. Why does he say that? Have you ever asked yourself? Why does he keep saying we need to return to joy? The theme is returning. Why does he say that? Well, 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 7 to 11. Just want to frame this for us. This is how I'm framing this theme of returning. I'm going to read from verse 7. It says, the end of all things is near. Therefore be alert and of sober mind, so that you may pray. Who disagrees that the hour is urgent? I mean, when you don't have to look far to understand that the hour that we're living in today is urgent. This is the hour for the sons and daughters, for the daughters and sons of God to shine. Writing about in a similar format, Paul in Philippians chapter 2 says this. He says, in a warped and crooked generation, this is what I want you to do, to shine like stars in the universe. The hour is urgent, my friends. And we're called upon to shine like stars in the universe. We are called upon to rise up. And he says, above all, love each other deeply. Say, love each other deeply.
Love each other deeply.
because love covers over a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Now I'm just going to stop there. First, they love each other deeply because love covers over a multitude of sins. What that says to me is he or she that deserves loves deeply is probably most positioned to hurt or sin against you who are called upon to love them greatly. Which is why you are being given a solution even before they sin against you, to say love deeply so that the love may cover over a multitude of sins. It's not just going to be one sin against you from them that you are called to love deeply, but it's going to be a multitude. You thought you are only called to love those that are easy to love. Return to love, loving deeply. But then it says, offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. This word grumbling, I went through some synonyms and stuff like that, and I found a word that is quite unique. It's called kvetching. 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 This is from a Jewish culture, and apparently it's part of the Jewish culture for people to just complain. They banter about, their banter is complaint, is laced with complaint. They complain about the weather, they complain about, everything. They just, like, when you're having a conversation, you just complain. This is that word, grumbling. There is so many reasons for us to complain. But the key, the antidote to complaining, corruption, rejoicing, return to rejoicing, return to joy, my friends. Without joy, you will not be able to love deeply, the kind of love that covers over a multitude of sins. And without that, it is impossible for us to do the thing that we are called to do, which is to be in relationship with the Father and to be in relationship with our neighbor. That is to love God with everything in us and to love our neighbor as we love ourselves.
In Isaiah 30, when the prophetic word is coming, the book of Isaiah 30 is the prophetic unction for the conference to return to rest, to return to the ways of God. The Israelites have been fashioned in a culture that operates a different way. It's a culture that is about strength, about posturing, about working, about striving. It's a culture that is, you got to help yourself or you'll be left behind. It is a culture that is constantly trying to measure up. It is a culture that is frenetic and frenzied. It is a culture that's trying to prove and trying to please, and on a wheel of performance, on a wheel of production. And it's into that culture that the prophet speaks and says to Israel, if you actually want to fight in a way that you can win, if you actually want to be the people of God, if you want healing, if you want freedom, if you want a future, come to me and rest. It's madness. Makes no sense. It makes no sense when you're in a dominant culture that measures you by your production, or that measures you by your strength, or that measures you by what you can make happen. It makes no sense to stop trying and to just rest. Unless you're a child. So I worked in an inner urban city really rough, and I worked a lot with women coming out of abuse. And one particular friend of mine, Dee, she struggled with abuse. She'd been sexually exploited and all kinds of abuse. So she was getting better. We were working together and all this kind of stuff. And then there was a guy. She'd always meet another guy. We'd be like, no, not another guy. And the guy was a really bad guy. I mean, he was a criminal. He was abusive. He was a really bad guy. And I remember, I really did not like this guy. I did not, right from the beginning, I didn't like him. The neck tattoos were a hint, and then his criminal record history, and then, but at first he's just the best guy, and he's the one, and all this kind of stuff. And so I was like trying to be supportive, but then she'd call me in the middle of the night. He's got a knife. What should I do? He's hiding in the closet. I'm like, get this guy out of your life. That's what you should do. And anyway, she gets pregnant. They're having a baby. He ends up going to jail for abuse again one more time. So he's in jail. She has a baby. And I've been working with her and praying for her, just praying for her resolve even, just to like stay strong. And I remember going to visit her in the hospital on the day she had delivered this baby, and I brought the flowers in. And when I entered, I got to her room, there was a guard at the door. And I remember thinking, that's weird. And then I said to the guard, what are you doing here? And he said, I'm here accompanying the prisoner. And I realized that the father, the prisoner, they let him out of jail to come see his newborn son. And I wasn't happy. And I remember entering into the room, and Dee was there. She was sleeping, and beside her was the little crib the baby's supposed to be in, but there was no baby. And I remember thinking, oh, God, why did they let this guy out of prison to visit his son? I just remember like my heart sinking. I just remember, where's this baby? And then I started to hear a sound, like the sound of weeping. And I turned the corner of this room, and I saw this prisoner still with chains on his ankles, and he was kneeling against the wall with this little newborn baby. And he was weeping. And he was weeping. And he looked at me with these tears, and he said to me, have you ever seen anything so beautiful? And I saw in the moment, I saw the baby beautiful, but I also saw the man. I saw through the distressing disguise of his own violence and pain and trauma and fear. I saw all the way through to him as a little baby. And I felt the Lord say to me, have you ever seen anyone so beautiful? God sees you like that. God sees you like that. God sees all the way through. And I don't know what it is about babies. Do you know what it is about babies? In Hebrews 11, it says that Moses' parents, they make the hall of faith as parents. It says that they made the hall of faith because they saw that Moses was no ordinary child. Have you ever seen an ordinary child? Anyone? Never seen an ordinary child. How many births have you been at? Have you ever went like, that's ordinary? Average baby. Just an average baby. I mean, babies are remarkable, aren't they? There's nothing ordinary about a child. When a child is born, there is something sacred, something holy, something true, something embedded in that childhood, in that. It makes absolutely zero sense for you to stop performing and stop producing and stop trying and stop defending yourself and stop trying to use chariots and weapons and anything at your disposal in the midst of a dominant culture that measures you that way. And actually, even for you to survive in that culture requires you to act like that, requires you to fight like that, requires you to do that. It makes no sense at all to actually return to rest unless you're a child. Unless you're a child. And I felt like when I was preparing for this and praying for this moment, a couple of years ago I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. I watched the sunrise at the top of the mountain over Africa. And I had moment with the Lord. I felt like the Spirit of God gave me this like sense, this deep, deep prophetic impulse that the Son of Righteousness was going to rise with healing in its wings, bringing salvation and healing to the nations from Africa. And I began to pray. I was working with a team who's doing some development all across Africa, and we had a prophetic vision of all these young people actually asking for these keys. We were opening keys, we were giving keys out, we were just multiplying keys, giving keys out, and all these African young people were going, opening nations, opening doors all over the place. It was this endless sea of open doors. African children, that's what I'm doing here. I'm just participating with God in a story that God's writing about Africa rising with healing, salvation, the message of salvation to the nations. I believe it with all my heart. But what I sensed God wanted to say and just kind of kick off this evening was to return to who you truly are. I want to talk a little bit about returning to who God really is, returning to God's power and God's presence and the way that God wants to move with power in the world. But tonight, I just really felt like God's like, return to who you are. Return to who I say you are. Return to how I see you. Return to who I am. And the message that kept coming to me was from Exodus 3, where Moses has moved on with his life. You know, he's in Midian with his father-in-law, and he's a shepherd. And then a burning bush comes. It's in Exodus chapter 3, if you want to remind yourself of the text. Let's just read it together. Exodus chapter 3, one day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock far into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush, and Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up. This is amazing, Moses said to himself. Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go see it. Now listen. When the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush, Moses. Moses. Before anyone does anything for God, God calls them by name. Who are you? I've read that story so many times. I'm here on this journey with my son, who's named Moses. So you better bet I know a little bit about Moses. When my son was really little, we had this ritual when I would put him to bed, and I would say, he's this little, now he's taller than me, he's only 12, but anyway, when he was little, he's like this little cherubim, he's just like little cheeks, chubby cheeks and a big smile, and I would say to Moses, Moses, who made you? And Moses would say, God made me. And I would say, he sure did, honey. How did he make you? And he'd say, he made me good. And I'd say, he did, honey. He made you good. He made you fearfully. He made you wonderfully. He crafted you, actually. He knit you together. He made you who you are, your personality, your impulse, the way that you're designed to be. He made you good. And I remember one night we were doing this ritual, and I put Moses into bed, and I closed the door, and I was leaving the room, and I felt like God said to me, Danielle, who made you? I said, oh, you made me. He said, yeah. How'd I make you? Oof. How'd I make you? Who made you? Who made you? God made you. And how did he make you? There is a theology that moved out of control, burned like a fire, straight from the pit of hell, that tries to convince you that you're bad. Does a good job. Tries to convince you that sin is the first word instead of the second word, and never the final word. Tries to convince you that somehow your origin story is rooted in sin, badness. Like we haven't read the whole story of Genesis, only chapter 2, only chapter 3. But starts chapter 1. Who made you? God made you, and how did he make you? He made you good. Sharp if you're in Soweto. Good. He made you good. And I can't help but think when Moses is encountering this fire, and then he's going to have a look, what is this? And he hears this voice, Moses. It's his creator. It's his maker. It's the one that has formed him and created him for this moment in time that he has forgotten about, that he has walked away from, that he has said, I don't have any time for that. I better make my life being a shepherd in the middle of nowhere because I already tried a whole bunch of things. I tried the chariots. I tried to fight. I tried to fight for justice even. I tried to do the right thing. And all it did was cause more harm. I talk about a burnout, right? It's just like a full-on burn. I can't do this. In the middle, then later, like a whole generation later, he is hearing now the voice of God say, Moses, return to me. I remember the disciples in the last time with Jesus, and Jesus is giving them all this information, and they're on overload. And Jesus says this incredible things. He said, I've called you servants, but that's not happening anymore. Now I call you friends. You know what you do with servants is you work. What do you do with friends? Yeah, you chill, man. You rest. You play. Do you know the opposite of trauma is play? No wonder Paul says to be joyful, to rejoice. No wonder the joy of the Lord is our strength. The opposite of trauma, of usury, of pain, of personal mental incapacity is play. You want to bring healing to the world? You should play with some people, make some friends. Call some people by their name, see through the distressing disguises right into the sacred center of who they are. Moses, who made you? Now here's what's interesting about the story. We always pick up the story of Exodus in chapter 1, and we forget that the story started before the oppression. Do you remember? Right? Joseph. And he brought his whole family. That family, Joseph saved Egypt from a famine. And then in response, Egypt blessed the Israelites and gave them. Do you remember how they entered Egypt? The scripture says that the Pharaoh was so overwhelmed with gratitude for the way that Joseph had served and saved Egypt and sort of built his wealth and his empire, that he gave those Israelites, his whole family, the best land in all of Egypt, the land of Goshen. It was the best land for shepherding. This is weird, guys. Because 300 years later, when we pick up the story in Exodus chapter 1, what are the Israelites doing? They're bricklaying. They're not shepherds anymore. Several generations have passed. There's a new Pharaoh who doesn't really like shepherds very much. And so shepherding became very out of style. If you wanted to get anywhere, go anywhere, if you wanted to keep up with your Egyptian neighbors, if you wanted to prove that you were good, if you wanted to accumulate any sort of wealth, if you wanted to fit in, if you wanted to actually keep up with the fastest growing empire in the world, what you needed to do was get into bricklaying and in a quick hurry. If you didn't want to get made fun of anymore at school for stinking like a shepherd, if you didn't want to be low on the pecking order, if you wanted to actually say that you could keep up with the Joneses, you became a bricklayer. And within 300 years, the entire Israelites' identity had moved from shepherding, even though they still had the best land in all of Egypt for shepherding. They moved from shepherding into bricklaying. And with the bricklaying came loads of oppression. Because you know what happens when you actually assimilate into a Babylonian empire? When you assimilate into an empire that consumes and takes and fights and dominates, do you know what happens? You get oppressed. You get oppressed. That's what happened. That's what happens in empires. When you join in the work of the empire, in the empire's ways, you get oppressed. I had a biblical scholar tell me when I was studying Exodus, he said, the only person that really calls the Israelites slaves in the story of Exodus is God. He said, think about it. What slaves do you know that own their own homes? What slaves do you know that have their own livestock? What slaves do you know that are so threatening to the biggest leader in the world, a superpower of the world, that he needs to actually oppress them in order to keep them down? What slaves do you know that have a representative that goes to speak on behalf of the people to the king? So Moses grows up in the empire, knowing the empire, learning the empire's ways, and then trying to use the empire's way, primarily violence and force and dominance and power over. He uses the force to actually kill the Egyptian to do the right thing. He's doing the right thing, but he's using the wrong way. And it only results in more empire, more death, more destruction, because you can't do the right thing in the wrong way and expect a good result. You cannot use the empire tools and expect a kingdom miracle. It won't happen. So Moses leaves, he flees, he has to. And he creates a new life, and he minds his own business, and he becomes what? He becomes weird. It's like God's just waiting for Moses to agree with him about who he is. Moses, who made you? God made me. How'd he make you? It wasn't ordinary. Even your parents saw that. The story always amazes me because it's built upon this classical story structure where Moses is saved as a baby, right? We know this. And by the way, if you think Moses started the Exodus, you haven't read it correctly. 5 women start the Exodus. It's super clear. It couldn't get clearer. I was on a plane recently with an old guy, and I was making some notes about Exodus, and he was a little hard of hearing, so the whole plane heard our conversation. And he said, I see you're writing notes on the book of Exodus. I've been in a men's Bible study at my church. I said, that's great. He said, so if you have any questions, you can ask me. So I said, excellent, I do have a question. Who started the Exodus? He said, well, God. I said, no, I thought it was a study. Of course God started the Exodus, but I mean, what human agent was involved in the Exodus? The greatest deliverance story of all time ever. Who did it, And he said, Moses. I said, I thought you were studying the Exodus. He said, well, who was it? I said, well, for two names that are named in the Bible are Shiphrah and Puah, 2 midwives who cared more about what God said than what Pharaoh said, even though Pharaoh had the capacity to take their life. End it right there. They just cared more. I guess they knew who they were. I guess what they did at the end of the day is rested in their identity as midwives because that's who God made them to be. Regardless of what Pharaoh thought, and that non-compliance with Pharaoh's orders is what actually helped Moses arrive on the scene. 2 midwives, they're named, by the way. In the first chapter of Exodus, the Pharaoh is not named. As a matter of fact, they're still talking about which Pharaoh was it specifically because Pharaohs had many names. 7 of them usually. Many, many names, all of them more glorious than the last one. But that Pharaoh's unnamed. There's only 2 people named in that first chapter, and it's 2 midwives who cared more about what God thought than about what Pharaoh thought and let the babies live. Jochebed is Moses' mother's name. It's the first name in the scripture that has Yah. You'll notice it later in chapter 3 where God introduces himself to Moses as Yahweh. Jochebed is Moses' mother. Someone who bears life, who sees that Moses is no ordinary child, who can see through the threat and the danger and the fear and the, it's too much and it's too hard, and can see through to the sacred origin center of her son. And the Spirit says, Moses, Moses, who made you? Both my parents are orphans. My mom was a foster kid, and my dad was sold illegally as a baby. $50. So we have in Canada a tradition called Mother's Day, which is a big deal where you honor mothers. And in my family growing up, it was always a bit awkward because on both sides of the family, there were no mothers. And even where there were mothers, they were painful stories. Stories of abandonment and rejection and trauma and pain. But my dad, who is a preacher, used to always say, this is the verses that we need to remind ourselves today. Isaiah 49. Can a mother forget the child that she's weaned? Can she do it? The question just hangs there in the scripture. The answer we want it to be is, no, that can't happen. No, that can't happen. Even as a mother, I'm like, no, that can't happen. But we all live in the real world where it does happen. And then the scripture goes on and it says, even though she may forget, I will never forget you. I have carved and engraved your name upon my hand. You are ever before me. Who made you? God made you. And how did he make you? I used to think that God used Moses in spite of him being a shepherd, and I fully now understand that God used Moses because he was a shepherd. Because he assumed the identity of the children of God, the identity that they always had, the identity that God had given. Who are you? Do you remember? Do you know? You are not a servant. You're a friend. Even when God invites Moses to confront Pharaoh, and Moses says, there's no way. How am I going to do it? Moses says. This is one of my favorite things. And God says to him, I don't know, what do you have? And Moses looks and he goes, I've got this shepherd staff. And God says, perfect. Let's start with that. The real secret to the prophetic invitation is that resting, that truly returning to rest, is to allow ourselves to rest because we're children of God. It is a returning to our identity. It's a returning to our sacred origin and calling. It is a returning to who it is that God says that we are. And it's in that place that we're rejuvenated by who we are. We're reminded that we aren't like everybody else. We're reminded that it's not the empire that defines us. We're reminded that we're not actually invited in here because we're successful or because we've proven ourselves or because there's some sort of standard that we're trying to live. We're reminded that we're here because we're with our Father. That this isn't a program, this is a presence, that this isn't a function, this is a relationship, that you aren't servants, but you're friends. And that matters to God, because it's out of that position that actually we can encounter the one who has the power to overthrow everything else, the one who is the answer to all of our needs, the one who can actually transform us from the inside out in a beautiful way to be fully the people that he's created us to be. But it's the hardest thing to do, because everything in us is formed in empire. So we just want to prove it, and we want to please it, and we want to actually earn it, and we want to show it, and we want to display strength, and we want to display numbers, and we want to upwardly ascend in what I call the Hercules addiction. We all want to be better than all the other humans, and we want to prove it, and we'll use God's power to do it. And God says, cut it out. Stop it. Return to me. Rest in my love. You know, the root word of compassion in Hebrew is womb. We were just talking about Jackie Pollinger, a friend that we have in Hong Kong who helps addicts through withdrawal. And one of the ways that she does this is she calls it reparenting, but she invites people to come for weeks at a time and just be unconditionally loved. They're undeserving, according to themselves. They've been addicts. They've been kicked out of their home. They've burnt every relationship. They have no real place to go. And they come into her home. They come into their place of community, and they're just loved. And I remember when I first went to see her ministry, and I started asking all these dumb questions. Do you ever meet somebody and you're a little nervous, and then all these things come out, and you're like, why did that come out? And because after they get unconditionally loved, she calls it the womb, where you don't have to do anything. You can sleep all day. You just have somebody pray over you. You can have a bath. Somebody massages your feet. Somebody's praying over you nonstop, trying to get through that withdrawal. And that whole thing is just to recreate a womb. She said she's very rarely met an addict that didn't experience rejection from the womb. So she recreates this womb, and she just says, come and be loved. And that's what they do, is just unconditional love. And I remember, and then they graduate from the womb into sort of like the toddler phase, where they get a chore and they start to contribute to the house and all this kind of stuff. And I say, well, what happens if they finish the womb, but they haven't been saved? They haven't given their lives to Jesus. What happens if how do they move on as brothers if actually in the womb they weren't saved? She just looked at me like I was an idiot. She's just like, it's never happened. It's never happened. Can you imagine? Of course it never happened. Have you ever been unconditionally loved? Have you ever been held by someone who loves you with the fullness of love, who looks at you and says, have you ever seen anything more beautiful? Who says, who made you, who calls you by name, who knows who you are, who's changed on the inside as a result of your birth? Have you ever met someone who loves you that fiercely and knows you that good and not been okay with it, not want to be in a relationship with that, not actually want connection with that? She says, it's never happened. No one's ever gone through the womb phase and went, I'm out of here. Everyone's like, I'm in. I'm all the way in. Tell me what to do. Show me what to do. Tell me how to contribute. Show me how to grow up in this place. Why? Because they were rested. Because they found the compassionate heart of God, the womb of Yahweh, who calls you by name. Oh, we'll get to the work. Of course we will. But we won't do it that way. Return. So when I was teaching this guy, Moses, to swim, I had a neighbor on our street who had a pool. She said, come on over to my pool, teach this kid to swim. So it was COVID days, so you couldn't really just get him a swimming lesson. So anyway, we took him over to this pool, and I was trying to teach him to swim. And Moses is all excited. He's like, okay, I'm ready. And I was like, okay, the first stage in learning how to swim is you have to learn how to float. So I'm like, you have to just kind of lie on the water. And I remember Moses is just like really excited, and he's like lying on the water. He's just like, am I doing it? Am I doing it? And I'd be like, no, stop trying so hard. And he'd be like, okay. And I'd be like, stop trying. You have to relax your whole body. You have to go limp like a noodle. You have to trust the water. And I was holding him under his back. I was just like, trust me. Just trust me. Just relax your body. Lean into it. And he's like, am I doing it? I'm like, stop trying. I'm like, literally, my neighbor's like, what's happening out there? I'm like, stop trying so hard. Relax. And then the Holy Spirit said to me, exactly. Stop trying so hard. Could you relax? You know, even concepts like surrender is like a really big deal in my life right now. And I'd be like, am I surrendered? Have I surrendered everything? Have I confessed everything? Am I pure enough? Are my hands clean enough? It's a holy hill I have to walk up. Can I give anything else more? Am I working hard enough? Am I serving the poor enough? Am I doing this? God's just like, you gotta relax. Stop trying so hard. Lean back. Trust my love. Get some time in the womb already. And the prophetic word comes again. Sure, you could use the chariot, you could use the weapons, and you can use the degrees, and you can use the formulas, and you can use the money, and you can use the accolades. Or you could know who you are. And you could rest in the womb of God. Want to try it?
Well, that's all for this episode of the Follower Podcast, friends. If you found that helpful, please share it with your world, subscribe to the podcast, leave a review. It helps us get these conversations in people's ears. If you want to find out more about the ministry of Follower, you can go to www.wearefollower.com. And until next time on the Follower Podcast, I hope that you continue to follow Jesus to the depths of his heart and the ends of the earth.